I have 3 leather jackets. 2 of them I purchased myself for $500 a piece, and the third I received as a gift. And it cost me the most.
Welcome to the Jurassic Park-Cast, the Jurassic Park podcast, where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel, Jurassic Park. And also not that too.
Well, the thing about that is...
My name's Ryan Rogers, and I'm a big dumb Jurassic Park fan. Welcome to episode 73, The Visitor Center, recorded December 16th, 2024. Thanks for joining me today. A continuing thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E. Check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today's intro is Black Coffee from Snail's second album, Charlemagne, and the outro is T-Shirts from his self-titled debut album, Snail. Writing corrections, I want to be very clear. In the last episode with my terrific guest, Dr. Hannah McGregor, she's one author in the pop culture series that I mentioned, in which there are many authors. I was unclear on that, but you don't have to be unclear on it thanks to this correction. Again, her book is Clever Girl, and it's a terrific read, which is summed up when it was said by its reviewer and author, Jess Zimmerman. Clever Girl doesn't just illuminate Jurassic Park. It turns it on its head, giving us permission and encouragement to see the rampaging gal-pal dinosaurs in an inspirational new light. Hannah McGregor is the most astute, engaging guide you could ask for, whether you're navigating a dinosaur-infested island or the patriarchy-infested wider world. Alright, in dinosaur news, let's talk about 2 new dinosaurs. This news story is from the journal Cretaceous Research, published August 20th, 2024, called A New Late Diverging Non-Hadrosaurid Hadrosauroid from Southwest China. Support for interchange of dinosaur faunas across East Asia during the late Cretaceous. This hadrosauroid was uncovered from the Zhengyang Formation of southwestern China, but it's the darndest thing. Geologists haven't been able to quantify a date for the rock formation, but this new dinosaur is hopefully helping them to narrow it down. The remains were found in 2022 and were declared the holotype CLGRP V00016, housed at the Hydrogeological and Engineering Geological Team of the Chongqing Bureau of Geological and Mineral Resource Exploration and Development. The specimen is comprised of the predentary, the left dentary, 2 middle dorsal vertebrae, 2 posterior dorsal vertebrae, the sacrum, interior and middle caudal vertebrae with chevrons, the right ilium, the left pubis, the paired ischia, the left femur, the paired tibiae, the left fibula, the left astragalus, left metatarsals 2 and 3, and the right metatarsal 4. Based on these remains, it has been diagnosed as an adult, medium-sized, non-hadrosaurid hadrosauroid, approximately 27 feet in length, with enough unique characters to identify it as a new species they've named Quanjiangsaurus changshangi, after the district name of the general geographic area. Quanjiang and Mr. Chengsheng Wang, who formerly reported the first Cretaceous dinosaur fauna in Quanjiang, and Zhongqing, made this Chengsheng Wang's Quanjiang lizard. What does a non-hadrosaurid hadrosauroid look like? Well, think of all the things in common between a Parasaurolophus and an iguanodon. It'd be under like 30 feet in length, have a beak and that classic hadrosaurid iguanodontian dentary jammed with its grinding teeth. It'd have big muscular hind limbs and a strong elongate tail with smaller forearms upon which it likely walked. And it could operate bipedally at times, and as an ankylopalexian, which is a group named after having a stiff thumb, it's envisioned as having that classic thumb spike you find in iguanodontids. But no armor, no frills, no crests. But they were big and dutiful herbivores for sure. Now, what's special about this discovery and paper is that the phylogenetic analysis machine has helped recalibrate Chinese hadrosauroids as something of an index fossil, sort of. Quote, the study of Quanjiangsaurus is very helpful in elucidating the late evolutionary history of non-hadrosaurid hadrosauroids in skeletal morphology, phylogeny, and paleobiogeography, in constraining the time interval of the Upper Cretaceous Zhengyang Formation in southwest China. Rather than listing off a bunch of hadrosauroid names, just believe me, there were a bunch of related dinosaurs, and that bears evidence to this quote. Given that the age assemblage of the 8 hadrosauroids closely related to Quanjiangsaurus in phylogeny spans the Santonian, early Maastrichtian time interval, the top of the Zhengyang Formation, from which Quanjiangsaurus is recovered, is possibly restricted to the late Cretaceous in age. Hierarchical clustering of 12 hadrosauroid-bearing dinosaur assemblages from the late Cretaceous deposits of Asia shows a strong correlation between the Zhengyang Formation and the Jakota and Barangoyot formations in Mongolia that supports coeval interchange of dinosaur faunas across East Asia. What is the range between the Santonian and the early Maastrichtian ages? It's like between 83.6 and 72.1 million years, which is an 11.5 million year span, although I'm sure they weren't talking about the limits of the Santonian and the Maastrichtian. Surely their analysis included some quantity of time within those periods too. So perhaps that 11.5 million is more like 15 or 20 million years. But they've narrowed down the date of this rock formation as approximately something. So that's a start, thanks to this index fossil. So this continues to show, as new dinosaurs are discovered, they offer insights into the greater question of the world of dinosaurs, piece by teeny tiny piece. So our next news story comes from the Journal of Historical Biology, which published an article titled A New Titanosaur from the La Colonia Formation, Chubut Province, Argentina, on April 10th, 2024. And in it, they name a new titanosaur, Titanomachia jimenezii. Titanomachia jimenezii derives its name in reference to a battle fought by the Olympians against the Titans in Greek mythology, in which the Titans were defeated, and fittingly, Titanomachia is from a time when the Titanosaurs became extinct, the end of the Maastrichtian Age, which was also the end of the Age of Dinosaurs. The name Jimenezii honors the late Dr. Olga Jimenez for being the first female paleontologist to study the dinosaurs from Chubut Province. So this makes the dinosaurs named Dr. Jimenez's End of the Titans. Titanosaurs are known as the largest land animals of all time, but this titanosaur apparently was not so large by comparison. At only about 20 feet in length, it was tremendously small compared to its truly gigantic relatives, but surprisingly, this animal, despite its meager size, was calculated to be quite sturdy or stocky for its size. Titanomachia shares derived features with saltosaurids and bears unique characteristics in the astragalus or ankle. The authors say Titanomachia, based on the known specimens, indicates a small-sized adult. Its estimated body mass ranges from 5.79 to 9.79 tons, with a mean body mass of 7.79 tons. This places Titanomachia in a size range similar to Saltosaurus and Nequensaurus, but heavier. The peculiar anatomy of Titanomachia's astragalus may be influenced by its greater body mass, although further evidence is needed to support that hypothesis. The holotype MPEFPV11547, housed at the Museo Paleontologico Edigio Ferrulio, was uncovered from the La Colonia Formation. It's comprised of a partial skeleton consisting of a posterior caudal vertebrae, which is incomplete, 1 to 6 incomplete ribs, hymal arches, left humerus, left iliac fragment, right pubic fragment, right femur, left, right tibia, right fibula, left fibula, complete astragalus on the right side, and an incomplete left astragalus. During the Campanian-Maastrichtian interval, Patagonia exhibited a diverse range of titanosaurs. Northern Patagonia was dominated by Aeolosaurines and Saltosaurines, whereas southern Patagonia was populated by large-bodied forms such as Nolotitan, which is identified as a putative Colossosaurian, and Puertosaurus and Dreadnoughtus. The presence of taxa such as Titanomachia to the south of central Patagonia could indicate the existence of a fauna composed of small titanosaurs, like the Aeolosaurines and Saltosaurines, coexisting with a fauna of giant titanosaurs confined to the south of the continent, resembling more closely the faunal association present in northern Patagonia. And so, this sturdy but small new titanosaur suggests that smaller titanosaurs coexisted with the giant colossosaurian big guys like Puertosaurus and Dreadnoughtus. In conclusion, Titanomachia exhibits unique morphological characteristics among titanosaurian sauropods, and its small adult size places it in a similar range as Saltosaurus and Nequensaurus, but heavier. The astragalus of Titanomachia displays an intermediate morphology between Colossosauria and Saltosauroidea. The authors go on to say that further research is needed to fully understand the diversity and evolutionary significance of titanosaurian sauropods in Patagonia during the Upper Cretaceous, and to confirm the relationship between body mass and the unique astragalus morphology observed in Titanomachia. Overall, Titanomachia stands out as an intriguing specimen with its distinctive characteristics and occupies a significant place in the evolutionary landscape of sauropod dinosaurs in Patagonia during the late Cretaceous. All right, with the corrections and the dinosaur news out of the way, please let me introduce you to my special guest this episode.
Yeah, I'm good to go. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, joining me today, you will remember my next guest from episode 51, Control. It's Scotsman and author of the novels The Heart of Pangea, The Lazarus Taxa, and his latest book, Broken Voyage. Welcome back to the show, Lindsey Kinsella. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
It is great to have you back on. We had a good time last time. I had a lot of fun. But there's one important question I don't think, got to ask you, and it was, what was your favorite dinosaur?
Oh, see, as an adult, no one asks you that enough, do they? My go-to answer is always Carnotaurus.
All right.
Just something about lanky, fast dinosaur with a silly little bulldog face. I love it.
Mm-hmm. I know that some of its first depictions in popular media would have been in that dinosaur movie Disney put out, and they were chunky. They were really, really formidable.
Oh, yeah.
But when I think about them, they almost, you're right, they're like this lithe, sort of salamander-esque almost shape to them, because they're so lengthy with no arms that kind of make them look as robust as they might. But you're right, they're interesting group, but very popular because they have those prominent horns that give them a distinctive look. And so they it sounds like a lot of people, when they go to make a modern media, it's a popular choice, because you can get kind of exaggerated with those horns too.
Oh, you can. And to be fair, I think from the sort of paleo perspective, we don't actually have any idea how long they were. So yeah, you can do what you want, and no one can argue.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too, because they aren't proper horns; they're protrusions of the skull. And I wonder how those necessarily manifest once you get the skin and scales and stuff on top of them. Do they look as gnarly as perhaps we imagine, or were they just, did he just have like a funny face?
I think we are fairly certain that it had sort of a keratin sheath.
Right.
So sort of kind of like bull horns it would have. I think bull horns are bone actually, aren't they? But it would have had a sort of keratinous structure of it, and we've no idea how long that was or what shape that was. So yeah, you get sort of wild illustrations where they have these sort of enormous kind of handlebar bills. But it could be. We don't know.
And it's crazy to imagine that, like, in terms of what sample we get from the fossil record, you get an example of an animal, probably in a greater variety of species. And so you look at the diversification of finches or the diversification of just all the different antelope or something like that you get. And so you get this one example of maybe who knows what wild deviations it might have represented over tens of thousands of years across populations and stuff like that. Who knows what kind of bizarre things it and its family, close family, might have done. It's strange stuff. Yeah.
Well, that's it. And we do only have one Carnotaurus.
Is that the one we get the skin impressions on too? Do we have that? Is that what?
Yeah, it's a really good one. There's one specimen, and it is really good. We know those little sort of, I forget the word for it, but they're like little lumps along its side, little skin nodules, and you always see it on TV. It did have those.
Yeah.
It's a really good specimen, but it is only one, and like you say, how representative is any one specimen of a whole population? You know, it's hard to say.
Well, yeah, great dinosaur choice, I think. So it's mid-December. We're talking on December 16th. This time last year, my mom was like, "Hey, what do you want for Christmas?" And I had no idea. And so I gave her, I was like, oh, I know something I actually would be kind of really into is, I give her a list of books that would be kind of cool to read one day. And she got me a whopping amount of books, which is pretty cool. But among them were The Heart of Pangea and the Lazarus Taxa. And so I had a chance to read them since the last time that we spoke, whereas I was asking you blindly about this and that. So it was wonderful to dig through them. There was tremendous surprises and depictions and to see the output of your imagination in terms of the fandom with dinosaurs manifest itself in something that other people can enjoy is pretty cool. So I was very happy to go through those. So they were, among the list of them. I haven't finished all of the books yet, but they're at the front of the line because I wanted to get through those. So the Lazarus Taxa, I know that we talked about it. Like I said, I didn't know much about what I was asking you about at the time, but it's a great science fiction piece. And it doesn't just have interesting science, but it has clever angles, cool dinosaurs, incredible stakes. There's a lot at stake for it, and twists and turns, which not every book does. So I know that was the first one you went through, but when you think back on that one, since then, what kind of feedback have you heard, and what would perhaps you most happy about when you think back on how the Lazarus Taxa turned out?
Oh wow! Well, firstly, thank you for picking up a copy, because it means a lot when you come across someone who's read the book. It's strange. It feels like such a long time ago. It wasn't really. I think it was 2022 I released it. But the process started in 2020. It was a COVID child, that book. I was bored, and I thought, you know what, I'll finally write the book that I've been meaning to do. It was a big learning curve, that book, and I think for anyone writing the first book, there's always that anxiety of how it will be received, because you've got no sort of baseline. So yeah, in the couple of years since it's been out, it has been amazing to see the sort of feedback and the reception for that book. I think it helped. I sort of built up this community of, you know, paleontology geeks like myself. So by the time the book came out, I sort of had a ready-made audience for it, and it was very much tailored towards those people. It was, you know, let's geek out a little about dinosaurs, quite a lot, really. Let's be honest. It's about 90,000 words of geeking out.
Well, I thought it was right up my alley. So there's nothing wrong. I know with Jurassic Park, Crichton spent a lot of time introducing people to something entirely new all the time. And so, like, to have something unfamiliar, not what they expect, isn't necessarily a problem. So to get detailed and to get nerdy about some of the elements is edifying in a way to, I think, even somebody who is new. I know that if you get into real sci-fi, you never know what you're going to get. They have to make up an entire new vocabulary and species and stuff like that. So I think there's nothing wrong with having something specifically detailed and unusual to enjoy in dinosaur realm, anyhow.
Yeah, I hope so. It was kind of, I don't know, I guess in a lot of ways it was an outlet for me, because you know, when you're sort of really nerdy about something and there's no one around you to nerd out with, you know, somewhere to just spill it all out was quite good to have. But yeah, I did sort of try to not, I think what a lot of sci-fi authors, and Michael Crichton himself would get really down in the sort of nuts and bolts of all of the science fiction. I very much didn't want to get into the nuts and bolts. I mean, the time travel element in particular, I was like, I want to nerd out about dinosaurs. I don't really want to get into quantum physics. And so I did very much tried to sort of smooth over a lot of that portion of the science fiction, and just kind of, I think I did it along the ways of, from the perspective of the character, and he just kind of zones out.
That's right.
And he comes back in, and I was like, yeah, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, quantum travel sounds like the thing you have to do. It's like when Crichton writes Congo, he's like, I don't know, am I really into crystals and like telecom, or am I into like murderous gorillas in an Amazon? Because you got to go through one to get to the other. He's like, well.
Yeah, that was it. I was like, I'll skip all the quantum physics. That'll be background. Let's talk about dinosaurs.
Yeah. So one of the cool things that Lazarus Taxa has is a really cool twist. And I won't spoil it because it is cool, and it is a twist. Like, you don't really see it coming, I don't think. Like, the groundwork is there, but I feel like when Crichton put Jurassic Park together, he wanted to do that too. And we get this, you know, mysterious inside man that Dodson is meeting with, and we don't know who it is. And it feels like there was like groundwork laid to make a cool twist, and it just never really manifested in a shocking way. Like, it wasn't a surprise. It was kind of just rather plainly. You know, Nedry starts doing his plot, and you're like, oh, this is just what he was discussing with Dodson. I remember that. And it's just kind of like matter of fact. It's not shocking. And even Dan Brown would have, albeit predictable, characters make their reveal to be the nefarious about faces. The Crichton kind of missed the boat. Like, but Lazarus Taxa has this wonderful twist, and it kind of really, the stakes change, everything. It's wonderful. So, like, the way the story was put together, if you said there was like a lot of trial and error or learning as you go on the fly, it was lessons well learned, because it manifested really nicely in the final text, I think.
Well, for what it's worth, I didn't see that twist coming either.
Good.
I think I was. I mean, that book took about 2 years to write. It's the longest I've spent on one, probably because it was my first. And I think I was probably 6 or 7 drafts deep, and I think I was probably doing dishes or something the minute I was like, oh, hang on, do you know what would be cool? Sort of went back and rewrote the whole thing to kind of work with that twist. So, yeah, it was interesting to have something sort of come out of nowhere, but you have to make sure that you lay the groundwork and that it makes sense, but without making so much sense that people see it coming a mile away. Yeah, it's a hard balance to reach, because I do occasionally have someone who's like, yeah, I mean, I figured out the twist from the get-go, and I'm like, wow, you know, but you need to foreshadow it a little, or it doesn't really feel like a payoff.
Yeah. Well, I think even the Sixth Sense, which is like the epitome of the twist, right? I'm sure that they were like putting that together, and I know I heard that was like, oh, we switched it midway through the script. Like we had the script and it was kind of dull, and we switched it, and we made the twist, the spoiler of the modern era, and that wasn't adapted until drafts later as well. So there's nothing wrong with that. You can come up with a great idea anytime. So.
Well, that's it. Yeah, definitely made a lot of that one up as I went. There was some planning that went into it, but yeah, that was learning on the job very much. But yeah, I was pleased of that whole. It came with a sort of mystery vibe in the end, which was never the intent going into it. In fact, I originally intended on it being a kid's book. I'm sure now that you've read it, you know that it's most certainly not a kid's book. By the time I was finished with it, it just kind of grew arms and legs, and it ended up with this really sort of intriguing mystery vibe about it, which was almost accidental, because like I say, the twists didn't come until late in the process. So, and it makes it a little tricky now that, you know, people are sort of asking for a sequel, and I do have good ideas for a sequel, but I have to sort of match that, and I have to bring in this. I have to mean it this time. I have to deliberately give it a mystery and a sort of a reveal of some kind. Yeah, it's tricky to replicate something that you did on accident.
Well, as long as it's running as a subroutine in the background, maybe it one day it'll be like, there it is. There's the idea.
It's churning there. The wheels are turning. It'll come eventually.
I think one other quality that it did was that it expanded the universe the story was set in a way that the narrative didn't include. Like there was kind of like, it almost felt like, I don't want to say impossible, but it was like, it just expanded the universe and offered more perspective on the time travel and things like that. I was like, it's great. It's cool that the twist also opened it up so much more, and you're like, there's so much more space here, and you get to experience some things that maybe you thought you weren't going to get to because of some of the limits that the story had. So again, all the parts of it I thought came together so cool and in all the right ways. So I thought, you know, credit where credit's due. That was really cool.
No, thank you so much. That means a lot.
So when you say that you're writing like you had ambitions to write something maybe for a younger audience, I don't recall there being many children in the Lazarus Taxa. But then when we get to the Heart of Pangea, like it is about a child, and that another really tremendous, interesting piece. As I was going through it, I didn't know what to expect. I just knew that I would be very interested in seeing what the book was going to be about. And there's this very Chronicles of Narnia feel to this fantastic world of anything goes. Like also like at Alice in Wonderland, there's this fantasy realm where the rules and different worlds are all kind of smashed into one place, and you don't really know what to expect. And when we talked about like geeking out or nerding out in a fan sort of way about dinosaurs in the first book, that doesn't even touch what happens in the Heart of Pangea. So even the very first beginning line about like, well, maybe you can describe what it spoils nothing to give you the first page or something like that. When Ed introduces himself, you immediately discover, we're in for a different type of narrative. What made you pick that choice and that perspective that to move forward in that way?
So I think in a lot of ways, the Heart of Pangea was me trying to kind of remedy the fact that the Lazarus Taxa ended up not being a kid's book, because in a lot of ways I wanted a book that I could read to my own kids. And part of the problem was that the Lazarus Taxa was, although it's sci-fi, it was ultimately set in the real world, and it was difficult to create the kind of tension and stakes that were required with dinosaurs without inevitably having some kind of gore and you know, it felt unnatural to not have that. So the Heart of Pangea ultimately stemmed from, well, what kind of scenario could I have where that doesn't need to be the case. And so that's where the world of Pangea, which is effectively imaginary, although I did like the idea that there's always that question hanging over it of, you know, is it real? Is it pure fantasy? Is it sort of something in the middle? And in this world that's just in someone's imagination, you know, anything can go there. The stakes don't have to just be, will you be eaten? You know, they don't just have to be animals. They can be so much more than that. And it kind of just grew arms and legs from there. And then that's where the notion of, well, if it's an imaginary world, an imaginary friend makes sense. What if we tell it from the perspective of the imaginary friend? Which I liked that it added that extra what's real and what isn't, because the narrator himself isn't real. And it's then, you know, is Ed the main character, or is it really Robin? And we're just sort of seeing a sort of skewed perspective of our own through Ed's perspective, because he's not real. Yeah, I liked the sort of complexity to that. I liked the idea that kids could enjoy it because dinosaurs, but adults could enjoy it because of that extra layer of complexity. It took a long time to piece together how that all works.
And Ed isn't just like an imaginary narrator, but he's also Dimetrodon, who happens to be the protagonist's favorite animal. And yeah, they work together. They do incredible things. And he has as many revelations, I suppose, as anyone, coming to terms with like, hey, is this real? Am I in the real world now? How is it? Did they see me? Like, what's going on? And I like that, because then you're like, what are the stakes? And maybe like, okay, so they're possibly more severe to what happens to our characters. I liked when we talked about like nerding out and stuff like that. It seemed like all of the naming, or a lot of the naming for most of the animals that were in the Heart of Pangea, were homages or honoring some of the most important people in the beginning of paleontology and things like that as well. There are a lot of interesting names that you would give to an animal that might be related to an interesting paper or foundational paper that were related to the discovery of that species or something like that. And so there was a lot of, like, as you're reading through, like, and even I think that their nationalities and dialects were reflective of where those animals were from. So if you were, for example, not necessarily really familiar, the characterization actually brought more details. You could learn more about the actual animal in some respects, maybe passively, that you wouldn't see coming, by following along. Or if you already knew, they're just like Easter eggs that are always like triggering at the back. You go, oh, okay, all right, and so they were rewarding in a lot of ways in terms of just, you know, hearing their names and stuff like that, to beyond the mixing and matching of like historical depictions and classical depictions of dinosaurs being represented versus you're right, when you do the Lazarus Taxa, they kind of got to be, you know, animals that look one way, but in this imaginary mythical world, the original iguanodon and the original megalosaurus get to stomp around like they're great big hippos or something like that, which is really cool. Hippo crocodiles or whatever they kind of looked like once upon a time. I thought that was fascinating too.
Yeah, I liked the kind of freedom that was offered with a sort of imaginary setting that, I could kind of mix and match things. And I always think that the Lazarus Taxa was kind of geeking out over dinosaurs, specifically over the sort of the animals themselves. The Heart of Pangea was more geeking out over the science of paleontology and the history of paleontology. And so, you know, like for example, it felt right that the villain would be based on Richard Owen, because he always felt like the kind of villain. He's in some ways the kind of father of paleontology, but also no one remembers him fondly, you know. And then it was like, you know, the idea that then this villain based on Richard Owen could be a kind of Victorian era megalosaurus.
Yeah.
You know, I love the freedom to do mad stuff like that, and it didn't seem out of place because there are no rules.
Yeah. And Richard Owens, there's a lot of good depictions of him where he just almost looks like the Crypt Keeper. They're like these dark eyes
Yeah.
that are sunk back into his head, and this long kind of hair, and he's just like glaring. He's like, "What? Am I even alive? Like, look at me." I like to.
Yeah, it was you can tell the people that drew him didn't think highly of him either.
That's right. They wanted that part to shine through. Yeah, and I think too, it feels like you're having a lot of fun. There felt like some like narrative. I don't want to call it fourth wall breaking or anything like that, but there was some like tongue in cheek narrative moments where it's like, I think you might even reference like a test reader's like input kind of shines through. The trials are getting a little long here, so test readers say that maybe I should cut this part down.
So there was that did happen. So I sent the story out to beta readers, and I sent it out to a few of them, and almost unanimously they came back with the suggestion that a certain scene or a certain chapter was a bit long-winded and maybe not all that interesting. And I thought to myself, I could come up with something else, but I kind of thought it would be funny to just cut it short and have one of the characters be like, yeah, the beta readers didn't. I had more planned, but the beta readers didn't like it, so just move on. And I actually think that worked out quite funny.
Mm-hmm. And there were interesting bits too, I think, where there was just like little interesting details about evolution and that weren't necessarily in the narrative. They just kind of had like a moment in the book where you talk about like the strangeness of crustaceans or something like that, and then the story continues on. I thought it's just like, oh, okay, and it didn't take long to just absorb that and go, that's thoughtful, something to reflect upon, and then the story continues. I thought those were interesting. What inspired you to do something like that?
So that I started doing that with the Lazarus Taxa. The Lazarus Taxa had those too, where you have these kind of short chapters where they're only a page or two long, where, like I say, it just kind of geeks out a bit. And it's not directly related to the plot. You could remove those, and the book would still read as the book does. But I thought it would be interesting to just sort of learn a little thing, because I love learning cool little things about paleontology, and I thought it would be cool if I could just include little bits here and there. And you know, sometimes it ties in a little, sometimes I tie it in a little with a sort of, you know, it becomes a metaphor for something in the story. But I mean, it's a little forced at times. It's really just there to have a couple of pages where you can read it and go, oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
And then move on. Because I think in a lot of ways, I would almost quite like to write sort of paleo non-fiction. The truth is, I don't have the qualifications to do that. But having just that little bit of non-fiction within the fiction, I thought was just kind of quirky, and it gives it something that I don't think you get in many other novels.
I can almost relate it to when you're like watching a film and they do an establishing shot or two, and it shows you like the busy city, and then like some farm life, and then somebody at the market, and then it moves into like picking up Jason Bourne or something like that afterwards. But it does like a little bit before that, and I see it almost like that. It's not really an interruption, but it does like there's a broader lens, and back to the story. And I think I thought it fit pretty neat. Yeah, and it keeps you thinking in that it keeps your headspace, I suppose, open to certain possibilities as you go forward. And you think like evolution gives you a lot of strange things, and then you move on to like who knows what strange thing is going to pop up next. But I thought it was pretty. I thought it was pretty good. I've seen on social media that on occasion you get a reader who goes through the Heart of Pangea, and there's the quote unquote that moment in the story where in the Lazarus Taxa we get like a really terrific twist. I think that there is a narrative development. I don't know if I would call it a twist that. Everybody seems to identify with, and it's like I think when you go to make a movie, when you go to make a piece of media, you want something that stands out and becomes kind of symbolic or memorable about it. And you go, yeah, this one, it's the one where this happens, and everybody kind of says that's a common experience to give them something to all relate to immediately when they think of your text, and it's got it. I've seen you kind of like share on social media that people do bring this up with you. What were I guess your expectations going into that? What did your beta readers say when you're going through that? And how is it the experience now that it's out there in the world, in the feedback you get? How are those things like the sequence? Is it what you expected? Is what you
Yeah,
schemed up in the beginning.
It definitely is, and that was. I think when you speak to most authors, you'll find that there's a common theme that most stories stem from like a single scene. There'll be a scene in our head, and we'll think, "Oh, that's cool," and the rest of the book will sort of expand from that. And the scene in question was that scene for the Heart of Pangea. That was where it all stemmed from, which made it an easier twist to work in because I always had that twist in mind. Yeah, I think initial feedback where, I got notes back from beta readers and even my editor, and I was sort of leaving comments along the lines of as it started to build up and you started to see what was coming, just leaving notes like, no, you wouldn't, don't you dare. But what I find is interesting about it is that sort of conversely to what we said about the twist in the Lazarus Taxa is that some people do see that coming. It doesn't ruin it. It just changes the reading experience. Because I've heard people who did see it coming a mile away. There are people who are like, "Yeah, I knew this was going to happen," but that actually, it just gives you a different reading experience because it then becomes this whole sort of bittersweet first 2/3 of the book where, it's hard to talk about too much without giving it away because I don't want to give it away.
No.
But it's nice that it's an enjoyable twist whether you see it coming or not, which I find interesting, and that was never really intended. It's a sort of, if I write a twist, I sort of try and hide it, but I can see why some people would see it coming, and it's nice to hear that that doesn't ruin the book. That just gives it a different angle. Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to extract some tears, and that's what we feed off as authors. We harvest the tears of readers.
and yes, you provoke them freely, I suppose. It was there, and I don't know if I was expecting it because I don't know if as I was reading, I don't know if I had spotted that feedback yet. So I don't know if I were anticipating to be surprised or not, but. I mean, there are outcomes that were possible that generally aren't leaned away from, and especially in a children's book. So it was interesting to see it develop as it did. One of the things I wanted to get to, so there were names. So what's great about the Heart of Pangea as well is that it's not just about dinosaurs. There is a tremendous broader scale of not only like the history of paleontology. So it's about history as much as it is paleontology. And as well, it's not just about dinosaurs. There are the aquatic reptiles, and there are, what do you call taxon that are named just off of footprints? There might be a name for that.
There is a name for it, and I cannot remember what it is. But yes, there is a name. Effectively, you name the footprint and not the animal.
Yeah.
So when you then... If you ever then discover what animal, definitely
how would you
footprint.
Well, it's the same with
name.
Yeah, same with eggs. When they find an egg, they declare the egg to be a species or a fossil or whatever Linnaeus decides it must be, and then and then maybe you match that with another species or not. I was looking into like egg taxa, and I didn't find anything on the Maiasaurs, which sounded bizarre because you'd think that. From what we've heard about the discoveries on Maiasaurus, that there would be lots of eggs. So they must be Maiasaurus eggs as opposed to... I don't know. I couldn't find anything on it.
I suspect that if they find them together, they don't. I suspect if it's purely a trace fossil,
well, like
then give it something else. Like we don't know what made this egg.
Like the oviraptor eggs they found once upon a time. That we found them right together. We didn't connect the dots. But one of the things that you include is, of course, a very recently extinct animal, the thylacine, who gets a fun Australian accent, gets to be quite the roustabout in the text. The name Benjamin, is that correlated with the thylacines? Does that come together?
Yes, it does. So there's a little bit of contradiction around it because the records of thylacines in captivity particularly well kept. So this is debated, but most famously or most accepted is that the name of the last thylacine in, I think it was Hobart Zoo, was named Benjamin. There are some people who say, no, that's just something that sort of newspapers came up with after it died, and it wasn't actually named that in real life, and his real name is lost. But that is typically what he is remembered as is Benjamin the Thylacine. So, yeah, that's where that came from. And it's quite a sort of sad story, that, and that I think the sort of political movements to protect the Thylacine had just come into effect, by which point it was sort of already gone.
Mm-hmm. And it's if that animal's not a common vernacular for others. It's the Tasmanian. Is it the wolf or the what do they? Is it
sometimes Tasmanian tiger, sometimes Tasmanian wolf.
Yeah.
Neither of those are especially accurate because it's neither a wolf nor a tiger. There are more. It has a lot of names. But yeah, I think I sort of interchanged a few of them throughout. But I try to stick to Thylacine because I didn't want to confuse readers and have people think that, maybe imagine an actual tiger if it was, particularly if it was a younger reader who doesn't know what a Thylacine is. So I was like, we just give it its proper name and we try not to confuse anyone too much. But I did like being able to have that sort of mishmash of animals, not be restricted to, what dinosaurs lived at this time in this place. I was like, we can have a Thylacine and a Spinosaurus and a Megalodon all in the same book, and it works in this setting. It's okay.
Yeah, absolutely, it's terrific. And I was noticing on the Thylacine wiki page that there is a pop culture section that lists different appearances of the animal in pop culture. I don't think you're in there yet. Have you considered?
I was going to say I would have been surprised if I was in there already.
I wonder if it'd be somebody could sneakily find their way in there and add that. I don't know who edits these things. I haven't looked that closely into it. The people who did dinosaur stuff seem to do a terrific job. So
I think it's I think it's frowned upon to put your own stuff on Wikipedia.
Oh,
you need to allow
widely,
the internet
widely.
to do that for you.
You get banned, I think, from the site. I don't know how that works. So if anybody out there does these sorts of things, that could be an interesting addition and a worthy addition. Benjamin's terrific. He's a real character in the story.
He was fun to write. I did. He was one of those characters who was based quite strongly on a sort of real person. I very much had Steve Irwin in mind with his whole personality. That way he's sort of relentlessly upbeat and positive. And I loved that. I always wanted to write a character who was a sort of homage to Steve Irwin. So, it was a lot of fun.
Right on. The homage to Steve Irwin, that's pretty terrific. I think that there's a lot of people who fashion their depiction of, now that we move past the crocodile Dundee, we can find maybe a more representative Australian. But it sounds like he was a lot of fun to write. And positive, upbeat, like a trickster in a lot of ways. Yeah, he was pretty cool. And that brings us to other interesting mammals. There was a paper you were mentioning, hey, maybe it'd be fun to talk about this frozen mummy of a cub that came up. So if people had been unaware, the Russians found something they called a Homotherium cub. I wasn't really familiar with Homotherium, but the name itself isn't especially forthcoming. It means, homo means the same, and therium means beast. So it just means it's the same thing as some other mammal, I guess. And then it's the name they have here is latidens, which means it has some fat teeth. So it wasn't especially forthcoming, but people will know perhaps what a saber-toothed cat is, and this seems to be a cousin family, part of this lineage of saber-toothed cats. What did you think of that? I know it was pretty, like, there's really cool pictures that came along with it. What did you think of that when it presented itself?
Yeah, that's the sort of big ticket paleo news in recent times. And I've always said paleontologists are quite often terrible at naming things.
Yes.
Right, it means nothing. But yeah, it's cool. Ice Age sort of late Pleistocene mummies aren't entirely kind of rare. I mean, you're not falling over them. It's not like every time you go out in the snow you find a mammoth, but they're by the standards of fossils and given the level of preservation, they're sort of common-ish, but not generally for predators, probably just because predators are less common in any environment. So we've had frozen mammoths, we've had frozen rhinos, but this, what's a saber-toothed cat? And it's cool, and it's not the saber-toothed cat that we tend to think of when we say that. What we tend to think of is Smilodon, which we will never find a frozen mummy of because they lived in South America or southern North America as well. But I doubt you'd find them far enough north for sort of permafrost. But Homotherium is close-ish related, and it's certainly not particularly closely related to modern cats, which I think is the big thing. I think a lot of what we consider about these animals we compare to modern cats, even though they are really quite distantly related. So yeah, and then here you have this little cub, and all of a sudden, we know what colour its fur was, and right, I know brown isn't all that exciting a revelation, but we know now, and we can see that it had this sort of structure of fur around its mouth, which suggests that in a full-grown one, when its saber teeth came in, that it had this sort of mustache to sheath its fangs, which is something that we would just probably never have really thought of. I mean, I've seen paleo art reconstructions of Homotherium with sort of gum pouches, or but this idea that they're just kind of hidden behind this kind of beard is cool. But I think there's a sort of emotional touch to it as well. We find fossils all the time that are bones, and we even find juvenile fossils, and we don't think too much of it. And there's something about seeing this little prehistoric kitten with its fur all in place, and it's got its little toe beans, and I guess it just reminds you that there's a sort of sad element to it as well. That I think they worked out that it was like 3 weeks old.
Yes. So they said that they measured its teeth, and that they were analogous with what you would expect from a 3-week-old lion's tooth. So if anything, it would resemble what we would expect of a 3-week-old lion, and probably correlates with something.
It's probably not far away.
Yeah. The other thing here, I always like looking at these things and finding words that like, thanks a lot. When I was the oracle, the Auricle, and it gives us the shape and position of the oracles now known by this. And like, what does that even mean? But I guess they're talking about like, what is the shape of the ear? And so you can tell, what kind of an ear does a fossil have? Well, who knows? But now we have a frozen mummy, and you can say, okay, it looks like a ear you would see on a lion. A shock of all shocks. but you can conclusively say it for a change.
Yeah, but it's an interesting look into things, isn't it? To be able to see with your own eyes basically how it looked in life. I mean, I think like the back half isn't especially well preserved, but from sort of shoulders forwards, it's like it died yesterday. It's amazing.
Yeah. The other thing I thought I saw, and maybe you'll remember this, I didn't catch the part about the whiskers, but they said that there was quite a bit of fur on the back of the nape of the neck, and you can only imagine how a cat carries its cubs. And at 3 weeks old, maybe it's got kind of lots of that fur, and they're just being toted around and then deposited down into a permafrost crevice for safekeeping for later.
Oops.
Hey, get out of there, you little... Come on.
Butterfingers. Yeah, I actually missed that part, but that's kind of sweet as well, isn't it? That you can see when it was carried around by its mum. Yeah, it's just interesting. It's just I think there's probably a lot of interesting stuff that doesn't make mainstream media. But every now and then there's something that really captures everyone's attention. And I think that's worthy. Yeah,
for sure. I think one of the other things I really liked about this is that they, so I understand correctly, and maybe you'll know better than I, rock formations, especially Mesozoic rock formations, you can't use like carbon dating because the carbon is expired or something like that. Like it just doesn't, there's nothing to measure. And so they generally rely on like other things to measure it. And I think that there's like lava layers that they can measure, and those can kind of give you a range, but you can't actually get the rock formation itself. Whereas, but it sounds like with this, it's young enough that they still can, and they were able to narrow this down to like 30,000 to 36,000 years ago. So we're talking a contemporary with people, but not necessarily us. But pretty wild. But when they say like the Pleistocene era, I think I was looking, it goes back like 2 million years. And so when you look at a fossil record, like when you're doing something with the Lazarus Taxa and you're trying to decide what goes into this, we know in a rock formation that spans like 8 million years that it does possibly contain animals that lived only 30,000 years apart that never saw each other in their lives at any time. So that makes an interesting decision when it comes to like picking, how do we picture a Mesozoic world? Can we imagine these dinosaurs interacting? It's like even ones that are kind of from like kind of the same era, it's hard to really even say, which is disappointing, like in a way. Kind of like you're really taking the fun out of the imaginative process. But
there are there are animals that we sort of find in the same rock layer, and we can say they probably coexist. And there are animals we find with really obvious signs of coexistence, like Triceratops and T-Rex. We know there's no doubt they live together because we find T-Rex teeth sort of embedded in Triceratops fossils. So, but yeah, there are ones where it's we find it elsewhere in the same region in a similar rock layer, which we've dated to a similar time. But like you say, we can't be accurate to sort of thousands or tens of thousands of years. I think there were probably some liberties taken when I wrote the Lazarus Taxa on that, but
no judgment. I'm just saying it's impossible to really know so much. It's crazy.
Well, that's it. And you've got sort of like the range of animals as well. You might know when they were alive, and you might know where you found them. But determining what their total range was can be quite difficult. So I think a good example of that was Quetzalcoatlus, which I included. There's not any evidence that it existed that far north. It was generally, I think Texas is where we find quite a lot of Quetzalcoatlus.
Sounds like Northrop I would have been found in. I think that's what it was. Would be found in.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that's coming to mind. I don't know that for a fact, but yes, Texas feels right.
So it's like, maybe it never made it as far north as what we see in the Lazarus Taxa.
But they were unconstrained by the ground.
Well, that was kind of my thought. It feels feasible. A large flighted animal probably has quite a wide reach, But you're right. There is no way to know for sure if those animals ever interacted. They could have been as ancient to one another as a mammoth or a Homotherium is to us now.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know I was chatting about Jurassic Park. All of the fossils in the book are supposed to be from northern digs, but of course Crichton included a Pterodactylus, which is decidedly from like almost equatorial South America, which is like the antithesis of northern digs. So it was interesting, like how could this be? But obviously, without being constrained to the ground, a Pterodactylus could fly anywhere it wished, and so therefore possibly could have fossils in northern digs to coincide with Hammond's digging and things like that, to not shatter the story's narrative too much. But birds they get around, that's for sure. Speaking of northern digs, I understand that your next book here is called Broken Voyage, and it sounds like it is about, you'll have to tell me, looks like people go up north and they get lost on an expedition or something like that. How close does that sound?
That was a smooth segue. Pretty much, yeah. So Broken Voyage is sort of my first book that doesn't deal with sort of prehistoric animals. Don't worry, I'll get back to that at some point. So it follows an illegal whaling crew, and they become stranded. Their ship is sabotaged, and they become stranded in the far north, in the deep Arctic, on the sea ice. And it's about them trying to make their way back to dry land before the ice retreats, and they're stranded there for good, which is ultimately a death sentence because they're not prepared to be there for any length of time. It's set in a sort of unspecified near future. The ideas will always feel like it's sort of a few decades away. I didn't want to put a year on it because I didn't want it to feel outdated and only 10 or 20 years. And yeah, the idea is it's to show that the world with, feeling just a lot more of the impacts of climate change, that we'll start to see, the sort of personal and political impacts of it. So a lot of climate fiction focuses on, giant tidal waves and tornadoes and everything's, I wanted to focus on more relatable issues. So, we've got mass immigration from hot countries because, well, they're not really habitable anymore. We've got, wars breaking out over water supplies. We've got economies tanking because of all that turmoil. So it's more personal effects. It's things that you can see happening. It might be hard to imagine a superstorm that destroys New York, but it's not hard to imagine being, struggling for finances. It's not hard to imagine your business going under. It's not hard to imagine, having to sort of deal with more extreme politics, because extreme politics come hand in hand with hardship.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that all of these people who are generally not bad people, but they're in a bad predicament and they're pushed to this sort of life of illegally hunting whales. So yeah, it's kind of a little more complex than the plot might say, but ultimately it is whalers end up being hunted by whales, which I thought was a nice little flip.
Is this an homage in any way to the Moby Dick trope of have you gone through Moby Dick? There's a bunch of classics and I just as an English guy, an English student, there's a bunch of stuff I didn't get to. I was like, I have to read The Lord of the Rings. I have to get through Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I got to go through these tomes of massive text, and Moby Dick was no exception. And I got through it, and they were fascinating. There were dry parts, but they were fascinating, wonderful elements. I can't imagine studying it because it's so big. How do you study all of it?
Oh, yeah.
but I wonder. It was so anybody who didn't get through Moby Dick, I hold no judgment against. But is this something that I did it because I felt obligated to?
I haven't actually attempted Moby Dick.
Yeah,
it is one I would like to read because I'm sort of broadly aware of the story,
and
it is fascinating. And yet there were certain elements of knowing what it's broadly about that sort of featured. But yeah, that's one to get around to at some point. It's a marathon of a book, isn't it? That's you train for that.
It's something. There's a lot in it. There's a tremendous amount in it. Well, that's cool because the hunter becomes the hunted, right?
Well, yeah, that's it. And it's I thought it was interesting to have protagonists who, in some ways, you feel maybe not deserve it. I wanted to sympathise with them a little. In some ways, I wanted to be at least part of the reader that's rooting for the whales, and a lot of that came. I was actually it was a David Attenborough documentary that sort of spurred that idea, and I was just watching an orca hunt. I was like, it'd be really quite frightening if you were a seal, and I was like, well, let's imagine a scenario where killer whales are desperate enough to look elsewhere for food, and that's where the whole sort of near future scenario came from as well.
And that's an interesting dichotomy of they're both desperate. They're both doing things they might not otherwise be doing. That's so fun.
That's it, and we do see a little of the story from the orca's perspective.
Okay.
They're intelligent animals. Yes. I was like, we can see a little from their perspective, and so you are kind of supposed to sympathise with the whales a little as well. The whales have got calves. They were previously following the whaling ship because they get some scraps, and well, what did they do now? The whaling ship's gone. So I liked that you're kind of sympathising with both the protagonists and the antagonists, and I guess it's up to the reader to decide which is which.
Well, they say always the best conflict is when you can see the issues on either side. Makes it most the deepest anyhow. The meat. There's a lot there to work with. There's a fascinating amount of imagination that must go into imagining the perspective of the whale, and to spend any time trying to explain that or live through that is, I think, when we talk about like actors taking on challenging roles or authors taking on challenging things, to do that sort of exercise and then try and show the world what you thought of it. What an interesting, that's like what writing should be, I think. So what an interesting way.
In a way that doesn't come across sort of cartoonish as well was important. But I didn't want to fall into the trap of something like Jaws, where it's just, you just portray something as a sort of mindless killing machine, to the point where, I mean, I think sort of statistics of shark deaths skyrocketed after Jaws came out. You know, this idea that you can instill fear. I wanted to, not that I ever think that I'll have anything like the impact of Jaws, but I wanted to get away from that idea of it's just a mindless hunter. You know, I'm like, well, see from their side too.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't necessarily want to eat you, but it's all, you're all that's around. So.
Well, among the score of books that were on my reading list that came to be a reality last Christmas was Raptor Red, and there was quite a bit of Robert Bacher's how he related how his dinosaurs recognized each other from other species, recognized each other from other individuals, how they made sense of the world through their sense of smell. There were some elements that like were so alien to what our navigation through the world looks like that he was able to express it in any way that made sense was tremendous. So it can be done. It can be done well, and so what a fascinating way to, and what a change of pace. Like you'd be like, oh wow, this is. Sometimes you get a book when you're like, oh, we're getting the perspective of the killer right away. We're not. It's not like a whodunit sort of thing. we just know. And to get right into the whale world would be, or the orca world. Are orcas porpoises? Or are they whales? Or what are they?
So they are technically the largest species of dolphin, but dolphins are themselves a subset of whales, so they're both.
Right on. Not all dogs are wolves, right? I got you, but some wolves are all. I got you.
Can you tell I spent a year on this nonsense?
I'll go to the source. That's really cool. What an exciting. Do you have other projects to tease?
Yeah, so I have a few things. So I've traditionally up till now been a sort of completionist, where I would work on one thing and not allow myself to be distracted. But I found myself too distracted last time around, to the point where it slowed me down. So I've allowed myself to work on multiple projects this time, which might mean it's a while before anyone's finished, but we'll see. I suppose the one that's closest to being complete is probably the one that I can tease. It's just a short story, and it stems from the fact that I love spiders, and I'm conscious that almost everyone else does not love spiders.
Right.
And so it really stems from the kill it with fire attitude that just winds me up so much, to the point where that's the title that I'm working on. I'll probably keep that title. I think it's a good title. The title is Kill It With Fire. And it's basically a sort of cautionary tale. So I wanted to write a horror for a long time. So it's a horror with spiders. So in some ways I'm sort of playing into those fears. But then ultimately I'll look to sort of subvert that and show you that, you know, spiders are cool. Leave them be. Just let them chill out. They'll eat mosquitoes.
Just a spider on fire and a title, Kill It With Fire. It sells itself. It's unbelievable. Wow, that's cool. Well, that's exciting.
Yeah. Beyond that, there is a sequel for the Lazarus Taxa in the works, which is a sort of skeletal early draft at the minute, and is probably quite a long way away from being anything close to finished. But it's in the works because people keep asking me. It is happening. I just don't know when.
Sequels are so challenging. I was just hearing about some of the concepts they had for Gladiator 2 when they wanted to include Russell Crowe again, and how might he not be in Elysium for the sequel. How might he be be able to be back into the gladiator realm? And they were absurd in a way that would make a good movie in a suspend your disbelief and leave it at the door and then change countries and leave it that far away in that sort of realm in a way that also doesn't really respect what Gladiator did. But anyhow, yeah, sequels, the opportunity, like, how do you make it work? I can imagine that there's like, oh no, I bet you there's a dozen bad ideas for every good one.
oh, absolutely. Because you have to sort of capture the vibe. You have to sort of capture what people liked about the first one, but you can't just rehash it. So it's like, how do you capture that same sort of feeling, those vibes, but also do something new? Yeah. I think that'll take me quite a long time to finish, just because I need to get that balance right. But it'll come eventually. Right on.
That's exciting. Well, what a wonderful time catching up. I'm so glad you reached out again. We didn't get to talk about Jurassic Park very much, but dinosaurs, books, right up my alley. This is great. Well, thank you so much for coming back.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's a shame we didn't touch on Jurassic Park in the end. Maybe I'll just have to be back on another time, and we'll actually talk Jurassic Park this time.
Let it be said right now, Lindsey Kinsella is always welcome. Whenever you like.
I appreciate it. I will gladly be back, and not just hijack it with me this time.
Hey, I wouldn't have done it any different if we had to do it 3 more times. How's that sound? Well, thank you for coming back on the show. This has been great. All right, in our work together here, reviewing all of the different scenes that are in the movie Jurassic Park and comparing it with the novel and comparing it against other drafts of the script and finding all of the elements that the script writers have used from the novel to include in the film, let's resume with our next scene, which is called the Visitor's Center. So we'll read through it. Here we go. Scene 8. 2 jeeps pull up to the Visitor's Center. It has the appearance of being the nerve center of the park, but is still a work in progress. There's a big hole in the wall, covered by a tarp. Fellow workers open the large front doors with a smile, and Hammond leads his guests inside, greeting everyone. John Hammond says, "G'day, g'day, g'day." Now, the most advanced amusement park in the entire world, incorporating all the latest technologies. I'm not just talking about rides, you know. Everybody has rides. We've made living biological attractions so astounding that they'll capture the imagination of the entire planet. Ali Sattler says, "So what are you thinking?" And Alan Grant says that we're out of a job. Ian Malcolm then adds, Don't you mean extinct?" Hammond leads them onwards to a room that appears to be a movie theater. Several seats with protective bars like a roller coaster chair sit in front of a screen. And Hammond says, "Why don't you all sit down? Donald, sit down. As they take seats, Hammond walks up to the screen, where another Hammond on the screen walks up, so to speak, to meet him. And Hammond says, Here he comes. Well, here I come. Yes." And the Hammond on screen says, "Hello." And John Hammond says, Say hello. And the others weakly reply with hellos, and Malcolm is waving half-heartedly. And the screen Hammond says, "Hello, John." And John Hammond says, Oh, yes, I've got lines. And screen Hammond says, "Well, fine, I guess, but how did I get here?" Well, let me show you. First, I'll need a drop of blood. Your blood. Right. When Screen Hammond extends his finger and Hammond mimes poking it. "Oh, John, that hurt." "Relax, John. It's all part of the miracle of cloning." As Hammond speaks, a second John appears on the screen, followed by a third, and then more, all greeting each other. And Alan says, "Clone from what? Loy extraction hasn't recreated an intact DNA strand." Ian Malcolm says, "Not without massive sequence gaps." Ellie Sattler says, "Paleo DNA, from what source? Where do you get 100-million-year-old dinosaur blood?" And Gennaro says, "Shh." On the screen, an animated swirl appears from Screen Hammond's finger. A cartoon DNA strand pops up over the shoulder of Hammond opposite the way he's facing and taps his shoulder, zipping to the other side. And Screen Hammond says, What? And then he sees the DNA strand and he goes, Oh, Mr. DNA, where did you come from?" Mr. DNA says, "From your blood. Just one drop of your blood contains billions of strands of DNA, the building blocks of life. A DNA strand, like me, is a blueprint for building a living thing. And sometimes animals that went extinct millions of years ago, like dinosaurs, left their blueprints behind for us to find. We just had to know where to look. 100 million years ago, there were mosquitoes, just like today. And just like today, they fed on the blood of animals, even dinosaurs. Sometimes after biting a dinosaur, the mosquitoes would land on a branch of a tree and get stuck in the sap. After a long time, the tree sap would get hard and become fossilized like a dinosaur bone, preserving the mosquito inside. This fossilized tree sap, which we call amber, waited for millions of years with the mosquito inside, until Jurassic Park scientists came along. Using sophisticated techniques, they extract the preserved blood from the mosquito and bingo, dino DNA. A full DNA strand contains 3 billion genetic codes. Mr. DNA is now standing in front of a screen with data flying everywhere. If we look at screens like these once a second for 8 hours a day, it'd take 2 years to look at the entire DNA strand. It's that long. Since it's so old, Mr. DNA suddenly dragged off screen when he's caught by one of the flying data chunks, and soon he reappears back on screen and continues talking. It's full of holes. Now, that's where our geneticists take over. Thinking machine supercomputers and gene sequencers break down the strand in minutes, and virtual reality displays show our geneticists the gaps in the DNA sequence. We use the complete DNA of a frog to fill in the holes and complete the code. Phew! And now we can make a baby dinosaur. John Hammond says, "The score is only temporary. It's all very dramatic music, of course. Rum-bum-bum. A little march or something that hasn't been written yet. And then, of course, Hammond clicks a button on a remote, and the tour moves on. And a safety bar clicks into place, and the seats begin to move, carrying them past glass windows through which they can see scientists hard at work." And apparently over the PA, Mr. DNA continues, "Well, looky here. Those hard-working cowpokes you see behind the glass." And Donald Gennaro says, "This is so overwhelming, John. Are these characters autoerotica? No, we have no animatronics here. These people are the real miracle workers of Jurassic Park." And the PA continues, "An unfertilized emu or ostrich eggs, and it's no..." And Grant says, "Wait a minute. How do you interrupt the cellular mitosis?" And Ellie says, "Can't we see the unfertilized eggs?" And Hammond says, "Shortly, shortly." And Mr. DNA over the PA continues, "Now a whole team of genetic engineers goes to work on..." And Grant says, "Can't you stop these things?" And Hammond apologizes. "I'm sorry, it's kind of a ride." And Malcolm looks over at Grant, puts his hands on the bars, and Sattler joins in. 1, 2, 3, and Grant, Ellie, and Malcolm work together and push up the safety bars, getting out of their seats and walking off. Hammond scoffs at their behavior, lifts up the bars, walking after them. Gennaro says, "You can't do that. Can they do that?" So that's the scene you all remember. First, as we look at the analysis of what came out of the novel to color this scene with details from the book. First, the visitor center is still a work in progress, and there's a big hole in the wall covered by a tarp, as we're seeing. This is the hole through which Rexy appears in the finale, if you can remember all of that coming together. That's neat. That's a little detail. Although when you look at that's in the script, but can you really see it in the film? Not really. Also, when Sattler says, "So what are you thinking?" and Ellen says, "That we're out of a job." And Malcolm says, "Don't you mean extinct?" Here's the line that Phil Tippett says was inspired during his visit to Industrial Light and Magic upon seeing how effective the computer graphics were compared with his stop-motion models. You remember that little story from, I think we were talking about it last episode. Grant says, "Clone from what? Lore extraction hasn't recreated an intact DNA strand." And Malcolm says, "Not without massive sequence gaps." And Sattler says, "Paleo DNA from what source? Where do you get 100 million year old dinosaur blood?" Obviously, this literally compiles 3 of 4 pages of the novel into 3 lines of dialogue, which is pretty economical. First is Grant's inquiry about the Loy extraction. We are told by Henry Wu on page 99, quote, "Well, most soluble protein is leached out during fossilization, but 20% of the proteins are still recoverable by grinding up the bones and using Loy's procedure. Dr. Loy himself has used it to obtain proteins from extinct Australian marsupials, as well as blood cells from ancient human remains. His technique is so refined we can work with a mere 50 nanograms of material. That's 50 billionths of a gram." The gaps Malcolm suggests are discussed by Wu further in the chapter version 4.4, as Dr. Wu confronts Hammond about the unpredictable behavior of the dinosaurs in the park. Quote, "But they're not real now," Wu said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. There isn't any reality here." He shrugged helplessly. He could see he wasn't getting through. Hammond had never been interested in technical details, and the essence of the argument was technical. How could he explain to Hammond about the reality of DNA dropouts, the patches, the gaps in the sequence that would have been obliged to fill in, making the best guesses he could, but still making guesses? The DNA of the dinosaurs was like old photographs that had to be retouched, basically the same as the original, but in some places repaired and clarified. And as a result, "Now, Henry," Hammond said on page 122. Here, the interruption from Hammond does a lot of work leaving that thought unfinished, and Crichton doesn't have to explain himself any further, even though there's probably a lot left unsaid. This is brilliant writing, especially for advanced and complicated science fiction. Just interrupt yourself and move on without any further elaboration. That's a hot tip from Crichton. Finally, there's Sattler's inquiry about paleo-DNA and what source it might come from, and Wu also adds on page 99, if this insect has any foreign blood cells, we may be able to extract them and obtain paleo-DNA, the DNA of an extinct creature. So that's right from the book, too. What else? On the line, there's 100 million years ago, there were mosquitoes, just like today. And just like today, they fed on the blood of animals, even dinosaurs. Interestingly, the word mosquito isn't in the book Jurassic Park. They say insects often, but not specifically mosquito. Even more interesting is the word bug. That is used almost as often as the word insect, but it never refers to insects. Instead, bugs refers to bugs in the code for operating Jurassic Park. So that's a fascinating piece of trivia you can use to shock and amaze your friends. Dino DNA. A full DNA strand contains 3 billion genetic codes. If we look at screens like these, once a second for 8 hours a day, it'd take 2 years to look at the entire DNA strand. It's that long. And this is also kind of spoken by Henry Roux during the tour. He says, quote, here you see the actual structure of a small fragment of dinosaur DNA, Wu said. Notice the sequence is made up of 4 basic compounds, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. This amount of DNA probably contains instructions to make a single protein, say a hormone or an enzyme. The full DNA molecule contains 3 billion of these bases. If we look at a screen like this once a second for 8 hours a day, it would still take more than 2 years to look at the entire DNA strand. It's that big on page 101. So that last bit is the same, though they've changed big from the novel to long in the script. What else we got here? So since it's so old, it's full of holes. Now that's where our geneticists take over. Thinking machine supercomputers and gene sequencers break down the strand in minutes, and virtual reality displays show our geneticists the gaps in the DNA sequence. We use the complete DNA of a frog to fill in the holes and complete the code. Phew! And now we can make a baby dinosaur. Now in the novel, it sounds more like this. He points to an image. This is a typical example because you see the DNA has an error down here in line 1201. Much of the DNA we extract is fragmented or incomplete, so the first thing we have to do is repair it, or rather the computer has to. It'll cut the DNA using what are called restriction enzymes. The computer will select a variety of enzymes that might do the job. We're told on page 101. The holes are called errors that aren't filled, but rather repaired. Rather than the complete DNA of a frog, they use, quote, restriction enzymes from a, quote, variety of enzymes that might do the job, which are, quote, ordinarily selected by the computer. This inclusion that they use the complete DNA of a frog in the film is also conspicuous in the script, whereas it's far less specific in the novel. Grant had been thinking about that. He had recently learned of an intriguing West German study that he suspected held the answer. When you made your dinosaur DNA, Grant said, you were working with fragmentary pieces, is that right? Yes, Wu said. In order to make a complete strand, were you ever required to include DNA fragments from other species? Occasionally, yes, Wu said. It's the only way to accomplish the job. Sometimes we included avian DNA from a variety of birds, sometimes reptilian DNA. Any amphibian DNA, specifically frog DNA? Possibly, I'd have to check. We're told on page 168. These gender-transferring properties are later described in the novel as, quote, it's not frog DNA, Grant said, it's amphibian DNA, but the phenomenon happens to be particularly well documented in frogs, especially West African frogs, if I remember. We're told on page 375. So, the novel is distinct from the film in its use of frog DNA, which has streamlined and simplified the DNA process as depicted in this film with Mr. DNA. Also, there is no virtual reality in the novel. It's the leading-edge technology Spielberg adapted into the script and visuals to make this a cutting-edge scene, as cutting-edge as scientifically possible, even though using virtual reality I don't think would be practical or very useful in this process. But what do I know about VR? Donald Gennaro's line, this is overwhelming, John. Are these characters autoerotica? This relates to Malcolm's line in the novel. It says, I take it they're not animatronic, Malcolm said. They're very lifelike. Yes, they certainly are, Hammond said. Well, they should be, shouldn't they? On page 80. This is from when they're gazing at the apatosaurs when they arrive on the island in the chapter Welcome. Animatronics are further mentioned in Hammond's chat with Gennaro on page 61. Well, Donald, Hammond said, to explain that you have to go back into the initial concept of the resort. The concept of the most advanced amusement park in the world, combining the latest electronic and biological technologies. I'm not talking about rides. Everybody has rides. Coney Island has rides. And these days everybody has animatronic environments. The haunted house, the pirate den, the Wild West, the earthquake. Everyone has those things. So we set out to make biological attractions, living attractions, attractions so astonishing they would capture the imagination of the entire world. Also, Mr. DNA over the PA says in unfertilized emu or ostrich eggs, and it's not, so it's cut off. At Jurassic Park, in the film, they're using unfertilized ostrich and emu eggs, whereas in the novel, an obscure company called Millipore Plastic Products in Nashville was purchased in 1987 by InGen, and a, quote, agribusiness company that had recently patented a new plastic with the characteristics of an avian eggshell. This plastic could be shaped into an egg and used to grow chick embryos. Starting the following year, InGen took the entire output of this Millipore plastic for its own use. On page 66, we were told. This is how they're growing the fetuses in the novel, not with the unfertilized eggs of emus and ostriches. Grant says, wait a minute, how do you interrupt the cellular mitosis? This is a point in the process that is described in the chapter The Tour on page 105. Tim saw still another room with technicians working at microscopes. In the back was a section entirely lit by blue ultraviolet light. Dr. Wu explained that their DNA work required the interruption of cellular mitosis at precise instants, and therefore they kept some of the most virulent poisons in the world. Heliotoxins, colchicinoids, beta-alkaloids, he said, pointing to a series of syringes set out under the UV light, kill any living animal within a second or two, on page 105. These poisons are important at the end of the novel, in combating the raptors, you'll recall, but in the film, it's just this line. How do you interrupt cellular mitosis? Grant says, can't you stop these things? I'm sorry, it's kind of a ride. This is a line literally adapted from Ed Regis in the novel, when they're out on the tour in the park, and Tim spots a raptor out in the wild. He demands that the safety inspection stop and investigate, but, of course, it comes with a hitch. Here's the excerpt. A raptor in that field. The stegosaurs are a mid-Jurassic animal. The stegosaurs are a mid-Jurassic animal, evolving about 170 million years ago, the recording said. Several of these remarkable herbivores live here at Jurassic Park. Oh, I don't think so, Tim, Ed Regis said. Not a raptor. I did! Stop the car! There was a babble on the intercom as the news was relayed to Grant and Malcolm. Tim says he saw a raptor. Where? Back at the field. Let's go back and look. We can't go back and look, Ed Regis said. We can only go forward. The cars are programmed. We can't go back, Grant said. No, Regis said. Sorry, you see, it's kind of a ride, on page 152. Finally, Grant, Ellie, and Malcolm work together and push up safety bars, getting out of their seats and walking off. Hammond scoffs at their behavior and lifts up the bars, walking after them. Of course, in the novel, they never stop the ride to investigate more fully. Instead, they are invited to join Harding to inspect the 6 Stegosaurus later. All right, that is from what we get in the film. But we have screenwriter David Koepp's first draft of the screenplay, and there is a lot that's similar, but I'll go over some of the things that were a little bit different, or maybe were more illuminating in a way that we didn't get in the first read-through. Right at the hop, we get a different vision of the visitor area. The main area of Jurassic Park is a large area with 3 main structures connected by walkways and surrounded by 2 impressive fences. The outer fence almost 20 feet high. So there's an outer fence and, presumably, a second fence inside that larger tall fence. Inside, there are 3 structures, which we'll recognize as a visitor center, a private residence, which is likely Hammond's bungalow, and an impressive cage, which is the raptor pen. The visitor center in the script is, quote, several stories tall, its walls still skeletal, unfinished, and there's a huge glass rotunda in the center. The novel tells us it is limited to only 2 stories high, and all glass with exposed black anodized girders and supports. Grant found it determinedly high-tech, we're told on page 87. In this way, you can imagine the all-glass building with anodized girders as being something that you'd perhaps see in Silicon Valley. Futuristic and high-tech. The movie gives us much more stylized safari theme with stucco walls and grass-thatched roofing. And frankly, in the movie, it's the size of a pretty big house, but hardly anything that you might think was large in terms of a convention center or anything like that. The second building looks like a private residence, a compound unto itself, with smoked windows and its own perimeter fence. And this is Hammond's bungalow, which is said in the novel to be elegant and set back among palm trees in the northern sector of the park on page 120. The third structure isn't really a building at all, but the impressive cage we saw earlier overgrown inside with thick jungle foliage. In the novel, the raptor holding pen was on a dirt path that went through a dense bamboo grove, at the far side of which was a double-layer chain-link fence 12 feet high with spirals of barbed wire at the top. And there was an electric hum along the outer fence, we're told on page 116. And we were told later the raptor holding pen has been rebuilt with electronic sensors to warn of another impending escape on page 147. In the novel, we also get a brief glimpse of the Safari Lodge, which is like the motel everyone is staying at, which is described as a, quote, dramatic low building with a series of glass pyramids on the roof on page 86. And it has iron bars and small windows, and the glass is tempered and set in a steel frame, we're told on page 87. Inside the visitor center, it's still unfinished, with a high ceiling, and it houses a large skeleton of a tyrannosaur that is attacking a bellowing sauropod. In the novel, this is a robot tyrannosaurus in a small auditorium, posing menacingly by the entrance to an exhibit labeled When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth on page 87. Koepp's script says they are sitting in a 50-seat auditorium, which is about what we see in the film. There's approximately 6 rows of 9 seats depicted in the movie. And when they break out and enter the science lab, there are supposed to be piles of amber, tagged and labeled with scientists in white coats examining it under microscopes. We don't see that in the film, nor is it described in the novel. When the presentation turns into a ride, the script says, Hammond throws a switch and safety bars appear out of nowhere, but in the film, he clicks like a remote control. And apparently Mr. DNA continues to speak over the transition through the extraction labs, saying, our fertilization department is where the dinosaur DNA takes the place of the DNA in unfertilized emu or ostrich eggs. And then it goes on to the nursery, where we welcome the dinosaurs back into the world. We don't really hear any of this, but I guess it's in there somewhere, running in the background. And then Gennaro has this wondrous grin plastered on his face, and he says, this is overwhelming, John. Are these characters, referring to the people, animatronics? And of course, the final draft, Martin Ferrero says, are these autoerotica? I don't know who ad-libbed this gem of a line, but Martin Ferrero might have been that funny guy. I don't know. It might be his inclusion. I'm not sure who did it. It's not in the first draft, so it may not have been Koepp's idea. I don't know. Other than this, as the threesome escape the ride, Koepp's first draft depicts it a little differently. Rather, we get this. The two of them, Malcolm and Grant, team up on the safety bars. Grant shoves his all the way back with one foot, and Malcolm does the same. They stand up and head for the door for the hatchery. And Gennaro says, hey, you can't do that. Too late, Ellie slips out from under her safety bar too and stomps right across Gennaro's seat. Gennaro says, can they do that? So, I guess in Koepp's first notion, they weren't all sitting together, but Ellie and Gennaro were in the same row, and she was able to just sneak through the bars. And finally, this isn't in the film, the safety inspection team reaches the door to the hatchery, and Grant tries to shove it open, but he thuds into it. He rattles the handle, but the door won't budge, as it's on a security keycard system. And Hammond steps up and takes his glasses off. And Hammond says, relax, Donald, relax. They're scientists. They ought to be curious. And he steps up to the code box. It's a retinal scanner, he explained. He pushes various code numbers, and the door opens. He steps aside, and the group eagerly goes up the stairs. Now, it doesn't make any sense, because a retinal scanner wouldn't require you to push various code numbers. You'd have your retina scanned instead, but I don't know. I don't work in Hollywood. I don't know how that all gets through, but maybe they got it right, and I'm the one that doesn't get things. In an alternate take on this scene, Koepp also scripted this. Grant runs up the stairs. Malcolm and Ellie eagerly try to get a look at the lab. Hammond and Gennaro come up and join Grant at the door, and Gennaro says, John, what I'm saying is, and Hammond says, relax, Donald, relax. They're scientists. They ought to be curious. And Hammond reaches the door, and Grant tries to pry it open. And Hammond says, Dr. Grant, just a minute. Or there's also another take here. He says, Dr. Grant, just a moment, dear boy. And he pushes the code and the door opens. Remember what Samuel Johnson said. And they step inside. They step into a cubicle. Curiosity is one of the pertinent and certain characteristics of a vigorous intellect. And the second door opens. Right, come along. So Hammond's quoting important people while they're going through that. All right. Finally, we'll go to Malia Scotch-Marmo's draft of her script. It's quite a bit different. Let's get through this. It starts in the visitor center at daytime, close on the iron security grating as it fits over a glass skylight. Above, masked workers welded on. Sparks fly. Grant stares up at it, thinking. Footsteps echo behind him as Regis, Ellie, Gennaro, and Nedry look around the unfinished building. The visitor center is 2 stories high, a lot of glass with exposed girders and supports. It's incomplete. Vines swing in the breeze where the back wall will go, and undressed cables litter the floor. Cables litter the floor. Even so, exhibit areas are in varying stages of completion. Behind several Spanish workers unpack masonry supplies. So as we described earlier, the glass and exposed girders closely resemble the novel in this adaptation. Grant says, "Where's Hammond?" Regis says, "Mr. Hammond is dying to see you guys." And Grant strides over to an exhibit as Gennaro paces impatiently. And Gennaro says, "Hot, hot. $10 billion and the air conditioning sucks." Regis smiles apologetically and pushes open a large window on one of the finished walls, and giant leaves and vines burst inside. Grant studies an exhibit in progress entitled When Dinosaurs Ruled the World. This is a large clock that presents millions of years as hours in a single day. Many brightly colored hours are allocated to the dinosaurs, and man receives the last second of the day. And Ellie walks up and says, "The audacity of man to get here at the last second and think he runs the show." Grant smiles at her inexhaustible enthusiasm. He looks at a painted mural of a raptor on one of the walls in the half-completed gift shop. This element is adapted from the chapter plans. On page 56 it says, Grant knew that people could not imagine geological time. Human life was lived on another scale of time entirely. An apple turned brown in a few minutes. Silverware turned black in a few days. A compost heap decayed in a season. A child grew up in a decade. None of these everyday human experiences prepared people to be able to imagine the meaning of 80 million years, the length of the time that had passed since the little animal had died. In the classroom, Grant had tried different comparisons. If you imagine the human lifespan of 60 years as compressed into a day, then 80 million years would still be 3,652 years, older than the pyramids. So that was, this idea of how do you compare time, geologic time, in a way. They've tried to do this, and the book tried to do it too. Continuing with Scotch-Marmo's draft, Nedry is at a Coke machine feeding it change. It doesn't work, and he slams his hand against it, and finally a cup drops down the chute, upside down, and it pours. And Coke splashes Nedry, and he curses and exits. So that villain gets his just desserts already. At the rotunda, Ellie pulls Grant over to a raised round display with a catwalk. In the unfinished display, a skeletal T-Rex and a raptor are locked in combat. Scaffolding is up around it, and painting supplies are scattered all around. And here we get another adaptation of the display in the visitor center. First a robotic tyrannosaur, now a skeletal tyrannosaur in combat with a velociraptor, and in the final film it's a tyrannosaur attacking what looks to be an apatosaurus, right? Nonetheless, script. Ed Regis glances at his watch, looks up, and smiles. At that moment, doors adjacent to the rotunda swing open automatically, and a soothing female voice comes out of the public address system. "Please come to the theater. In a moment, our film will begin." The voice goes on to give this information in a number of languages, and Regis waves everyone into the theater. Nedry doesn't join them. He climbs the stairs to the second floor. So in the screening room, we finally get to the moment where Hammond comes out. Small and plush, Regis sits in the front, full of enthusiasm. Grant and Ellie sit further behind, and Gennaro stands in the back, and he smokes. Also, beyond John Arnold, nobody smokes in the book, or in the movie really, except John Arnold, until now. Apparently Gennaro is a smoker too. Lastly, in the novel, Lex and Tim are both on the tour with the consultants, but they do not arrive until after all of this in the film. Finally, Scotch-Marmo's script leans heavily into its own direction, so check this out. Celestial music fills the room. Mist covers and curls on the stage floor. Colored spotlights illuminate the mist in an eerie fashion. Overall effect is this touristy Where's New York high-gloss production. So I don't know what Where's New York high gloss production refers to. I double checked how it's spelled. Where's capital N capital Y question mark. I don't know what that means. You're welcome to email me with an explanation if you've got one. But I don't know. That's the overall effect and the stage direction that Scotch-Marmo gives. There's something strange with the editing here because it says blank years young with a glint in his eye and very comfortable with his own effect. He wears a white linen suit and a red rose in the breast pocket, like an elder Carl Sagan. He addresses the group. So something got cut off here, and this is actually the first sighting of John Hammond. We don't see how old he is, but we kind of get a description of how he is dressed. It's strange, right? It's like he was half omitted, and this half sentence just begins without stating his age, so that, I don't know, maybe it remains a mystery in Scotch-Marmo's interpretation. In the novel, of course, Hammond is 76 years old, we're told on page 391. And then finally Hammond says, "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to an ancient and mysterious world. A world long before humankind inhabited it with all our remarkable dreams in question." Enter a world that existed 100 million years ago, when our changing Earth was the abode of magnificent creations. Today, the late 20th century has witnessed a scientific gold rush of astonishing proportions. The headlong and furious haste to unravel the mystery of genetic engineering has become more than just a subject for science fiction writers. Now, this we have heard before, actually. This is from Crichton's introduction, if you recall. On the page Roman numeral IX, or 9, back before the book really starts, these same words are said. The late 20th century has witnessed a scientific gold rush of astonishing proportions, the headlong and furious haste to commercialize genetic engineering. This enterprise has proceeded so rapidly, with so little outside commentary, that its dimensions and implications are hardly understood at all. And it concludes on Roman numeral XI, or on page 11, before the book starts. Genetic research continues at a more furious pace than ever, but it is done in secret, and in haste, and for profit. This moment is also a second mention of science fiction writers. Genetic engineering has become more than just a subject for science fiction writers. Recall Scotch-Marmo used this earlier during Grant's excavation in Montana, where Grant says, "The science of paleontology can't answer these questions," which is the behavior of fossilized bones. "Novelists and artists who dream of a vision of the Jurassic period can attempt these questions with their imaginations, but what we scientists can say is considering the mass and kinetic articulation of these bones, that this animal had a vertical leap of about 12 feet. Not as entertaining as fiction, but absolutely fact without prejudice." So that's two mentions of science fiction writers in the script, which is likely a decided nod to the source material by Scotch-Marmo. All right, back to the script. We get Grant, and he's whispering to Ellie, "The furious haste to commercialize genetic engineering." So this furious haste is also from Crichton's introduction, as we just heard in the above quote moments ago. And then Hammond, he's warming to the subject. "Biotechnology promises the greatest revolution in human history. It will outdistance atomic power and computers in its effects on our everyday lives. We'll see square trees for easy lumbering and white trout for super visibility to fishermen. Why, it will transform every aspect of human life, our medical care, our food, our health, even our very entertainment." And Grant, it focuses on him. He goes, "Oh, here we go." And Hammond concludes, "Nothing will ever be the same again. It's literally going to change the face of our planet as we know it." All Hammond's ideas listed in this moment here, with the white fish and all that stuff, are from the novel too. So, quote, "Biotechnology promises the greatest revolution in human history. By the end of this decade, it will have outdistanced atomic power and computers in its effect on our everyday lives. In the words of one observer, biotechnology is going to transform every aspect of human life, our medical care, our food, our health, our entertainment, our very bodies. Nothing will ever be the same again. It's literally going to change the face of the planet," which is said on page Roman numeral 9. So that's direct from the source. And then the music soars. Hammond smiles appreciatively, removes his rose from his pocket, recall, and a screen descends behind him, and Hammond says, "Jurassic Park. What we do here is made possible through the miracle of DNA replication, commonly known as cloning. To explain what cloning means, I'm going to need my own clone. John Hammond." Another Hammond appears projected on the screen beside the real one. The second Hammond says, "Hi, John." And Hammond says, "Hi, John." In the audience, Ellie laughs out loud, and Grant's shaking his head but smiling. And back on Hammond, the original speaks to the clone. "Okay, John, hold out your finger." And the second says, "Why? I need some of your genetic material." "Now, just a minute here, John. Your genetic material is the same in every cell of your body. You have 100 billion cells. You won't miss a couple." And so, this "Hello, John" sequence is from Malia Scotch-Marmo's imagination. No Mr. DNA yet, but this is definitely where that entire sequence begins for Koepp and in the final draft. And Hammond holds his rose to this screen and pricks his clone's finger with a thorn. "Ow! That hurt. Hey, what's..." And the clone dissolves into a cascade of blood, and we see a magnified view of the bloodstream. Crazy. Animation begins, which illuminates the parts of the blood and its actions, and Hammond provides voiceover for the visuals. "John, let's look into your blood. The river of life. There's your white cells, exquisitely evolved to clean up bodily wastes. And there's a mighty nucleus, the hearts and brain of a cell. This nucleus has an amazing property. It can split in half and reproduce itself. That's how it grows. And then those two can do it again and again. making copy after copy of itself. And note, there's perhaps a nod here to the great David Attenborough, who has narrated so many nature documentaries that to have Richard Attenborough narrating the sequences is like a perfect match, right? Then back to the two Hammonds joined by a third, and then a fourth, and so on until the screen is crammed with Hammonds elbowing each other for room. And the new Hammonds are like, "Hi, I'm John Hammond. Hi, I'm John Hammond. No, I am," etc. They're arguing. And then the original Hammond says, "Come on, that's enough of this. And I thought to reproduce myself, I had to do it the old-fashioned way." Wink, wink, right? New mist fades out this show, and the lights go up, and Regis applauds, like the publicist he is. And Grant joins in laughter with Ellie and Gennaro. And Hammond jumps down from the stage and greets Regis and Gennaro. And he says, "That's all we've got so far. A lot of fun, isn't it, Mr. Gennaro?" And Regis says, "You bet." And Hammond greets Grant and Ellie warmly. And then Hammond baits Grant. "It's been a long time, Alan. I know the proceeding was not your sort of entertainment, popular science." And Grant says, "No, I don't mind popular science. I dislike the commercialization of science. It breeds a sloppiness, a disregard for method." Hammond retorts, "Well, I don't disregard method, but think of mutation, which is nothing more than sloppy communication on the cellular level. Think how triumphant mutations have been in natural selection. Oh, but I know what you're saying. It's true that I have never been afraid to make money with science. I've always considered profit to be a measure of success, a barometer of public reaction." And Grant retorts, "Mr. Hammond, the essential truth of a scientific law has nothing to do with public reaction. Water freezes at 32 degrees whether you pay for it or not." And Hammond turns to Gennaro. Gennaro smiles nervously at their clash. "Donald, in bringing my old friend Alan Grant, you've brought an excellent critic to observe the viability of my island and our venture. I look forward to winning you over, Dr. Grant." And Ellie says, "Just what is it that you're trying to clone?" So astonishingly, to this point in Scotch-Marmo's script, they don't know about dinosaurs yet in this draft. That's incredible, right? All right, we move outside. We have a sprawling lawn in the daytime, and outside Hammond leads Gennaro, Grant, and Ellie, and he points out the staff living quarters, a group of graceful teepees. Next to their homes, workers hang laundry and cook on grills, and they pass a large mechanical building. The generator housed within it is very loud, and the wind increases, and they're rippling clothes, and then suddenly the sound of a speeding Jeep comes by, and Grant looks, and racing across the rolling green landscape is a red Jeep. Muldoon is at the steering wheel. Two kids bounce happily around in the open Jeep. They are Timmy, who is 9, and Lex, who is 6, brother and sister. The Jeep stops. So the first thing we'll talk about here is the setting. We don't really see living quarters for staff in the novel, but they must be somewhere, right? They aren't taking an 18-hour boat ride to go to work every day, I don't think. That they're living in teepees is a little strange. Recall teepees are in the novel, but they were what Grant and his excavation crew were using, as related on page 32, when Bob Morris looks and he sees at the foot of the hill, he sees 6 teepees of the camp, the flapping mess tent, and the trailer that served as their field laboratory. Then on page 33, Grant tells Bob Morris, "No, it's just the best way to live out here." Grant explained that in 1978, the first year of the excavations, they had come out in North Slope octahedral tents, the most advanced available, but the tents always blew over in the wind. They tried other kinds of tents with the same result. Finally, they started putting up teepees, which were larger inside, more comfortable, and more stable in wind. "These are Blackfoot teepees built around 4 poles," Grant said. "Sioux teepees are built around 3, but this used to be Blackfoot territory, so we thought." So Grant is embracing the teachings of the Blackfoot people when their fancy scientific octahedral tents weren't working out. That's interesting. Second, Lex and Tim have arrived, and their ages are inconsistent with the novel. Tim is 9 here, but in the novel he is 11, and Lex is a few years younger, making her about 7 or 8, something like that. Lex yells, "Grandpa!" and Hammond looks up delighted. His arms are opening. Gennaro pulls him close, and Gennaro says he's incredulous. "Mr. Hammond, this is a serious investigation of the island, not a weekend excursion or a social outing. We're talking about the safety of this place." And Hammond waves to the children. "I'm aware of that, but I built this place for children. You can't investigate it without their reactions. They're what this place is all about." And Hammond beams to Grant and Ellie and indicates the running kids. "My grandchildren. Genetics were kind. They're more like my ex-wife than me." Lex jumps right into her grandpa's arms. Timmy shyly walks up and embraces him. Hammond shines. Gennaro holds in his fury. This is in the novel too. Gennaro is super pissed that there are kids on the safety inspection, as related on page 91. At the foot of the mountain, Gennaro was screaming over the sound of the helicopter. The veins of his neck stood out. "You did what? You invited who?" Take it easy, Hammond said. Gennaro screamed. Are you out of your goddamned mind? Now look here, Hammond said, drawing himself. I think we have to get something clear. No, Gennaro said. No, you get something clear. This is not a social outing. This is not a weekend excursion. This is my island, Hammond said, and I can invite whomever I want. This is a serious investigation of your island because your investors are concerned that it's out of control. We think this is a very dangerous place, and you're not going to shut me down, Donald. I will if I have to. And so this is kind of like a coup de grace on page 94. Tim overhears Gennaro whispering to Hammond, I could kill you for this. In other words, Gennaro is pissed. All right, let's end the tour part here. And we'll pick up at their visit into the extractions lab in the next episode. So a giant thank you to Lindsey Kinsella for coming back to the show. Lindsey, it was great having you back on. Thank you for continuing to write cool books and coming onto the show. I want to sign off today thanking you for joining me too. If you want to read along in the book, add some thoughts to what we've been discussing on the show, be a guest on the show, and chat with me about anything you like about Jurassic Park, you can do that by connecting with me. I'm at ryansrogers@gmail.com, and if you'd like to be a guest, you can drop me a line. We can try and set something up. We can rehash, tear down, gush over, and chit-chat about any part of the book, or also not the book, all you'd like. The Jurassic Park-Cast is part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novelettes, The Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. You can find links to all that baggage in the show notes by visiting schickens.blogspot.com. And you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, or on X at RogersRyan22. Thank you dearly for tuning in to the Jurassic Park-Cast, Jurassic Park podcast, where we talk about the novel Jurassic Park, and also not that too. Until next time. Showing somebody... We'll cut that out. That's the...